Thank you for joining us for a look at the life of Elizabeth I. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Now lie back and dim the lights as you join us on this journey through the life of Elizabeth I. The story of Elizabeth begins in a world already turning against her before she even took her first breath. In September 1533, the bells of London rang out not in celebration, but with a muted sense of disappointment. King Henry VIII had waited anxiously for news that his second wife, Anne Boleyn, had given him the son he longed for. Instead, he was told it was a girl, healthy and red-haired, but still a daughter, and for a king desperate for a male heir it felt like a bitter setback. That child was Elizabeth, who would one day rule as one of the most formidable monarchs in history, but in that moment she was simply an unwanted reminder of a failed promise. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had risen to the heights of power through charm, ambition and determination. Henry had broken with Rome to marry her, casting aside Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, after years of struggle to produce a male heir. Anne was meant to be the solution, the key to the continuation of the Tudor dynasty. Yet the birth of a daughter was seen as failure, and with that failure came the first shadows that would hang over Elizabeth's life. She was barely born before whispers began to circulate, questioning her value, her place, and even her survival. The court into which Elizabeth was born was not a safe or gentle place. It was a battlefield of power, influence, and suspicion. Every gesture and every word could mean the rise of one family and the ruin of another. As an infant, Elizabeth could not know it, but her very existence had already made her a figure of political debate. To some she represented the hope of a new future, the fruit of Henry's bold break with Rome. To others she was a living reminder of scandal, of a king's reckless gamble, and of a queen many saw as an interloper. Her earliest years were shaped not by warmth and security, but by this climate of intrigue. When she was only 2 years old, the world around her shattered. Anne Boleyn, once the bright star of Henry's court, fell with shocking speed. Accused of adultery and treason, she was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. For the young Elizabeth it meant the loss of her mother, before she was old enough to understand who she was. Anne was executed in May 1536, and Elizabeth, suddenly marked as the daughter of a disgraced woman, was declared illegitimate. Her title of princess was stripped away, and she became the Lady Elizabeth, her position in the world unstable and precarious. For Henry, Elizabeth was no longer central to his plans. He moved on quickly, marrying Jane Seymour, who soon provided him with the long-desired son, Edward. With Edward's birth in 1537, Elizabeth's place in the line of succession seemed irrelevant. Yet even as a child she showed the sharpness of mind and the resilience that would mark her life. She began to receive an education far beyond what was expected of most girls of her age and status. Tutors recognized her intelligence, noting how quickly she picked up languages, how keen she was to learn, and how disciplined she was in her studies. These qualities would later define her reign. But as a child they were simply signs of a girl, determined not to be crushed by the shadows of her past. Despite her father's shifting attentions, Elizabeth maintained a relationship with him that was cautious but significant. Henry was a man of fearsome temper and unpredictable moods, and Elizabeth learned early on how to handle him. She showed respect, flattery when needed, and above all a keen sense of when to remain silent. This ability to read people, to hold her tongue until the right moment, became one of her greatest strengths. It was not affection that kept her safe at court, but this instinct for survival. Her relationship with her half-siblings also helped shape her childhood. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had herself been declared illegitimate after Henry set aside her mother. She was much older than Elizabeth, and the years of bitterness between their mothers made their connection uneasy. Yet both girls shared the experience of being set aside and diminished, and in later years that common thread would make their bond complex and sometimes dangerous. Edward, born when Elizabeth was just 4, would eventually inherit the throne as a boy king. She showed genuine care for him, perhaps because she sensed in him the same vulnerability she had known. The bond between them was more tender, though it was cut short by his early death. Life in the royal household during Elizabeth's early years was often unsettled. She moved between estates, cared for by governesses and servants rather than her father. Yet she was never forgotten entirely. When Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, entered his life, Elizabeth found herself drawn into a circle that valued learning and piety. Catherine Parr took a close interest in her stepchildren, and under her guidance Elizabeth's education reached new heights. She studied Latin and Greek, along with French and Italian, and began to read philosophy, theology, and history. For a girl who had once been dismissed as unimportant, this education gave her both confidence and a weapon. Knowledge was power, and Elizabeth was learning how to wield it. But childhood was not free from danger. After Henry's death in 1547, Elizabeth was only 13. She entered the household of Catherine Parr and her new husband, Thomas Seymour, who quickly revealed himself as reckless and ambitious. His behavior towards Elizabeth was troubling and has remained a matter of speculation for centuries. He would visit her in her rooms in the early mornings, tickle her, and embrace her in ways that caused alarm among her attendants. Catherine Parr at first tolerated these encounters, perhaps dismissing them as playful, but eventually she recognized the risk. Elizabeth was removed from the household, her reputation once again under threat. She learned from this scandal the importance of guarding her image, of avoiding even the hint of impropriety. For in a court where enemies were always watching, rumors could destroy as easily as facts. The mid-years of her adolescence were a time of constant watchfulness. Elizabeth lived with the knowledge that her position could be swept away by the smallest shift in fortune. She was not the daughter of a queen who had died peacefully in her bed, but of a woman executed as a traitor. That legacy haunted her. People whispered that Anne Boleyn had been guilty, that her blood had tainted Elizabeth. Others claimed Anne had been innocent, a victim of a king's paranoia, and that Elizabeth's sharp mind and fierce spirit were proof of her mother's true nature. Whichever tale people believed, Elizabeth was never free of the association. She understood from an early age that she carried her mother's ghost with her wherever she went. The England she grew up in was itself unstable. The break with Rome had set the kingdom on a course of religious division and conflict. Elizabeth's own position in that struggle was delicate. Her mother's marriage to Henry had been justified by the break with the Catholic Church, yet her father had not been consistent in his policies, and the realm swung back and forth between reform and tradition. Elizabeth absorbed these changes, watching closely but rarely declaring herself too boldly. She was cautious, learning to adapt, to mirror the faith that seemed safest in each moment. This flexibility, which might be called pragmatism, would later become central to her reign. As a girl, she was also learning about loneliness. Without a mother, with a father who saw her more as a symbol than a child, she relied on her own inner strength. Her governesses remarked on her seriousness, her discipline, and her ability to command respect even as a teenager. She was not the kind of child who relied on charm or playfulness to win affection. She carried herself with dignity beyond her years, and those who served her began to sense that she was destined for more than the shadowed life of a forgotten princess. By the time Elizabeth reached her teenage years, she had already endured the execution of her mother, the neglect of her father, the scandal of Thomas Seymour, and the constant fear of being judged unworthy. Yet, rather than breaking her, these experiences sharpened her. They taught her restraint, patience, and the value of appearances. She understood the court as a stage where survival depended on knowing your role and playing it with skill. Behind her measured words and careful gestures, she hid a fierce determination not to be cast aside. When she looked back later in life, she could not have failed to see how much her childhood shaped the queen she became. The little girl who was born unwanted, declared illegitimate, and left motherless before she could even speak grew into a woman who would rule for more than 40 years. That transformation began in these early years, in the crucible of danger and disappointment, where Elizabeth learned to endure. Her childhood was not a story of innocence lost, but of strength forged. In a world that doubted her, she learned to believe in herself. In a court that could destroy reputations overnight, she learned the importance of silence and control. In a family torn apart by ambition, she learned to trust only cautiously. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The child Henry had almost cast away, yet within her burned a resolve to outlast them all. This is how Elizabeth's story begins, not with triumph or splendor, but with the frailty of a child born into a dangerous court. The lessons of those years would never leave her. They were the roots of her survival, the foundation of her reign, and the first steps of a life that would change England forever. Elizabeth's teenage years flowed into early adulthood under a cloud of uncertainty. Her father's death in 1547 left the throne to her younger half-brother Edward, a boy of only 9 years old. Henry had tried to secure the succession in his will, but England was not a country that could be guided easily by a child king. Power passed into the hands of regents and ambitious nobles, and Elizabeth once again found herself on the margins of the court. She had wealth, she had an education that outshone almost everyone around her, but she had no security. The child who had grown up learning to be cautious was about to enter a world where one wrong word or one unlucky association could mean ruin. Edward's reign was short and troubled. He was a delicate boy, prone to illness, and his council was divided by greed and ideology. Elizabeth kept her head down, yet she could not avoid being drawn into the turbulence of the times. Religion was at the center of everything, and Edward's protectors pushed the realm further into Protestant reform. Elizabeth adapted. She attended services as expected, she read the books placed before her, and she shaped her image as a dutiful sister. But in private she remained careful never to be too outspoken. She knew what it meant to live in the shadow of suspicion. She remembered her mother's fate. When Edward died in 1553, still a teenager himself, the throne passed into crisis. The young king had feared that his elder half-sister Mary, a Catholic, would undo his reforms. To block her path, he tried to name Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin, as his heir. Jane, barely 16, was placed on the throne for 9 days before Mary's supporters rallied and swept her aside. Elizabeth, watching these events unfold, must have felt a mixture of fear and caution. She could see how fragile power was, how quickly a crown could be won and lost, and how dangerous it was to stand too close to it. Mary's entry into London was triumphant, yet it cast Elizabeth into an uneasy role. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had displaced Mary's mother, Elizabeth had always been a figure of suspicion. At the same time, she was the most obvious Protestant heir. For many who disliked Mary's return to Catholicism, Elizabeth represented hope, a future where reform might continue. This made her both valuable and dangerous, admired by some, but watched closely by others. Mary, for her part, wanted peace within her family. At first she treated Elizabeth with warmth, inviting her to court and trying to build a bond. Yet the gulf between them was deep, born of history, religion, and distrust. Elizabeth's very presence was a reminder of Mary's mother's humiliation. Worse still, Elizabeth attracted loyalty from those who wished to challenge Mary's authority. No matter how carefully Elizabeth held her tongue, her name was whispered in plots and conspiracies. One such plot, the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554, almost ended her life. Thomas Wyatt and his supporters rose against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, fearing that England would fall under foreign control. Elizabeth's name appeared in rumours as a figure the rebels hoped to place on the throne. Whether she was truly involved remains uncertain, but in the eyes of Mary's advisors suspicion was enough. Elizabeth was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had been held before her execution. For Elizabeth, the echo of history must have been terrifying. She was only 20, and she knew that the Tower was not merely a prison, but often the last stop before the scaffold. Her time within those stone walls left a mark on her soul. Guards watched her every move, her letters were intercepted, and she was pressed to confess to things she had not done. She pleaded her innocence with dignity, writing to her sister that she had never sought to harm her, and asking to be granted an audience to defend herself. For weeks she did not know if she would live or die. She must have walked through the chambers where her mother had once stood. She must have felt the cold shadow of that axe waiting. Yet fortune turned. There was not enough evidence to prove her guilt, and perhaps Mary herself hesitated to condemn her young sister without cause. Elizabeth was released, though not to freedom. She was kept under house arrest at Woodstock, watched closely by guards, her movements restricted. Even there she was not safe from intrigue. Spies reported on her words, noting who visited her and what they said. Elizabeth responded with the same skill that had already preserved her life. She spoke carefully. She smiled when required, and she allowed no reckless statements to slip from her lips. Her silence, her patience, and her discipline became her greatest armor. She endured months of isolation, never certain whether she might be summoned back to the Tower. Mary's reign pressed on, defined by her determination to restore Catholic faith to the realm. Hundreds of Protestants were executed, burned at the stake as heretics. These events gave her the grim title of Bloody Mary, and while Elizabeth did not openly oppose her sister, she could not escape the association people made between her and a different future. For every victim of the flames, Elizabeth's value grew in the eyes of reformers. She became the silent alternative, the promise of change, though she herself avoided speaking those promises aloud. Elizabeth's position was made even more precarious by Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain. If the Queen bore a child, Elizabeth would be pushed further down the line of succession. In 1555, rumours spread that Mary was pregnant. For Elizabeth, the news must have been alarming, for it threatened to end her importance entirely. Yet the pregnancy proved false. Another cruel twist of fate for Mary, who longed for motherhood but never achieved it. The disappointment weakened her health and her spirit. For Elizabeth, it was a reprieve, a reminder that fortune, as much as caution, guided her path. As Mary's reign faltered, Elizabeth prepared herself with the same quiet patience she had shown since childhood. She did not challenge her sister openly, but she did not retreat into obscurity either. She maintained her household, she kept her mind sharp with study, and she allowed her name to be spoken by others rather than by herself. When courtiers came to her with words of support, she listened but offered no rash pledges. When enemies tried to entrap her, she smiled and deflected. She survived by mastering the art of saying little while implying much. Mary's health declined further in 1558. She was weary, without an heir, and burdened by a country restless under her rule. The moment the crown began to slip from her head, the eyes of the realm turned to Elizabeth. After years of doubt and suspicion, after imprisonment and fear, her time was coming. Yet even as the prospect of power loomed before her, she must have remembered the long path she had walked. She knew the danger of ambition, she knew the fragility of crowns, and she knew that survival demanded more than simply waiting for luck. It demanded strength of mind, restraint of tongue, and above all a sense of destiny. When Mary died in November of that year, Elizabeth was 25. She was at Hatfield when the news reached her, and it is said she fell to her knees beneath a great oak tree, giving thanks in words drawn from the Bible. In that moment she became queen, but the shadow of the throne that had followed her since childhood was not entirely gone. It lingered in the lessons she had learned in silence, in the scars left by fear, and in the memory of her mother's fate. Elizabeth's journey to the crown was not a triumphal march, but a slow passage through danger and suspicion. She had survived a childhood marked by disgrace, a youth scarred by scandal, and young adulthood shadowed by imprisonment. She had seen the Tower's walls. She had walked the path of the condemned, and she had emerged alive not by strength of armies or wealth of allies, but by the sheer force of patience and intelligence. Every trial had taught her something. From her father she learned caution. From her mother's story she learned the cost of rash ambition. From Edward's brief reign she learned the fragility of kings, and from Mary's suspicion she learned the value of restraint. These lessons did not end when she became queen. They became the very foundation of her rule. But as she stepped into that role at 25, she carried the memory of years lived under threat. She was not a ruler born in glory but in danger, and it was that danger which had forged her character. The girl who once lay in a cradle while bells rang with disappointment had risen, against all odds, to wear the crown of England. The shadow of the throne had followed her through every stage of her youth, shaping her into the woman she was now. That shadow would remain, but no longer as a threat to her life. Instead, it would serve as a constant reminder of what it meant to rule, of how fragile power could be, and of how much skill it took to keep it. Elizabeth's reign was beginning, but the story of her survival before she wore the crown was itself a tale of endurance, patience, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be destroyed. Elizabeth's accession in November 1558 marked the turning of a tide, not only for her but for England itself. At 25 she was young for a monarch, yet her path to the throne had already been marked by danger, disappointment, and survival against the odds. Those years of hardship had made her cautious, patient, and deeply aware of how fragile power could be. When news of Mary's death reached her, she is said to have knelt upon the ground at Hatfield and spoken words of gratitude, as though she understood that her life, which had once seemed doomed to the Tower, was now bound to the crown. The relief she must have felt was matched only by the weight of what lay ahead. She was no longer simply the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the suspect sister, or the silent alternative. She was queen, and the realm expected direction. The England Elizabeth inherited was wary. Years of religious strife had left the kingdom divided and restless. Mary's reign had been harsh in its defence of Catholic faith, and the burnings of Protestants had created an atmosphere of fear and resentment. The marriage to Philip of Spain had unsettled many, and the failure to produce an heir left the succession uncertain until Elizabeth took it. The treasury was weakened, the crown was in debt, and the people were unsure of what lay ahead. Elizabeth stepped into this storm knowing that every decision she made would be watched, weighed, and perhaps resisted. Her first great act was to shape her image. Elizabeth had learned from childhood that appearances mattered as much as words, and now as queen she understood that how she presented herself would define her reign. She planned her coronation carefully, ensuring it was both magnificent and inclusive. On the 15th of January 1559 she processed through London to Westminster, dressed in white and gold, her red hair shining beneath a crown. Crowds lined the streets, cheering for her, hopeful that she might bring an end to the turbulence of past years. Pageants celebrated her, poets praised her, and common folk called out blessings. For a kingdom starved of stability, her presence was a balm, and she made sure to show herself as accessible and gracious. She smiled, she reached out to touch hands, and she listened to the cries of the people. In those gestures she bound herself to them, setting the tone for a reign that would blend royal grandeur with personal charisma. The coronation itself was a blend of Catholic ritual and Protestant intent. Elizabeth was crowned in Westminster Abbey with the traditional ceremony, but her advisors were already working on the religious settlement that would define her rule. She knew she could not lean fully towards Rome, nor could she embrace the more radical reformers. To do either would risk tearing the realm apart once again. Instead, she chose a middle path, one that became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. In 1559, Parliament passed the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity. The first made Elizabeth Supreme Governor of the Church of England, not Supreme Head as her father had been, a choice of words that allowed for some measure of flexibility. The second restored the use of the English prayer book, though with language softened to make it less offensive to Catholics. These measures did not please everyone, yet they created a fragile peace that lasted through much of her reign. Elizabeth's handling of religion revealed her skill as a ruler. She was less concerned with theology than with stability. She believed that her subjects' consciences were their own, so long as they outwardly conformed to the law and did not threaten her authority. By insisting on outward unity, but tolerating some measure of private difference, she avoided the extremes that had marked her sister's rule. It was not an easy balance, and dissent remained, but for the time it gave England space to breathe. Her council played a vital role in guiding these early years. Elizabeth surrounded herself with men of ability, chief among them William Cecil, her principal secretary. Cecil was loyal, pragmatic, and skilled in administration. He advised her with patience and caution, shaping policy while always respecting her authority. Elizabeth relied on him deeply, and their partnership became one of the cornerstones of her reign. Together they navigated the immediate challenges of debt, diplomacy, and domestic division. One of the pressing questions facing Elizabeth was marriage. From the moment she took the throne, foreign ambassadors and English nobles alike speculated about whom she might wed. Marriage was not simply a personal matter for a queen, but a political one, a decision that could forge alliances, strengthen claims, or divide factions. Offers came from across Europe. Philip of Spain, her sister's widower, even considered proposing. Others suggested archdukes of Austria, French princes, or English nobles. At home, Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's childhood friend, was whispered about as a possible match. Elizabeth handled the matter with calculated ambiguity. She listened to offers, entertained negotiations, and hinted at possibilities. Yet she never committed. This strategy allowed her to keep suitors hopeful, thus maintaining alliances while preserving her independence. Whether she had ever truly considered marriage remains uncertain, though her bond with Dudley was certainly close and provoked much gossip. What is clear is that by refusing to wed, she kept control of her own destiny. In a world where queens were often defined by the men they married, Elizabeth chose to define herself. Over time, this decision hardened into the image of the Virgin Queen, wedded only to her kingdom. The early years of her reign were also marked by the question of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Elizabeth's cousin and a Catholic, with strong supporters who believed her to be the rightful heir to the English throne. At this stage, Mary was still in Scotland, married to the French Dauphin, and her position seemed secure. Yet the mere fact of her existence posed a threat. Elizabeth, cautious as always, watched events closely, aware that Mary's claim could at any time be used by those who wished to undermine her. The tension between them, though not yet at its peak, was already simmering. Beyond religion and marriage, Elizabeth faced the task of restoring the economy and asserting England's place in the world. The crown was in debt when she inherited it, and the value of the currency had been weakened by debasement. Under Cecil's guidance, reforms were introduced, the coinage was stabilized, and careful financial management began to restore confidence. Trade expanded, voyages of exploration began to push English ships into new waters, and a sense of possibility stirred. Elizabeth understood the symbolic power of these ventures, even if she did not fund them directly. They showed that England, though small compared to Spain or France, was not without ambition. At home, Elizabeth made use of ceremony and presence to strengthen her authority. She travelled on royal progresses through the countryside, staying in the homes of nobles, and allowing her subjects to see her. These journeys served several purposes. They allowed her to display herself as a living symbol of the crown. They reduced the burden of her household expenses by shifting them onto her hosts, and they reinforced loyalty by honouring local elites with her presence. Wherever she went, crowds gathered, drawn by the chance to glimpse their queen. For a people accustomed to distant rulers, Elizabeth's willingness to show herself was powerful. Her court too became a stage where power and culture blended. Elizabeth loved music, dancing, and the arts, and her patronage encouraged a flowering of creativity that would come to define her age. Poets and playwrights flourished, painters captured her image in ever more elaborate style, and the idea of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, began to take hold. This was not accidental. Elizabeth understood that image was as much a tool of rule as law or force. She carefully managed how she was painted, insisting on symbols of youth, strength, and majesty. Even as she aged, she would not allow depictions of herself that showed weakness. The image of Elizabeth, as timeless and commanding, was one she crafted with great care from the very start of her reign. Yet beneath the splendour and pageantry there remained the same qualities that had carried her through her dangerous youth. She was cautious, watchful, and rarely moved without considering every angle. She asked endless questions of her counsellors, sometimes to the point of frustration. But in doing so, she gathered knowledge that allowed her to make her own decisions. She trusted her instincts, she valued her independence, and she never allowed herself to be dominated by any one advisor or faction. The early years of Elizabeth's reign were thus a time of transition. England shifted from the turbulence of Mary's rule into a period of cautious stability. The Queen herself established her image as both regal and accessible, her policies as moderate yet firm, her court as a centre of splendour and loyalty. Yet the challenges she faced were far from over. Abroad, Spain and France loomed as powerful rivals. At home, Catholics plotted, hoping to see Mary, Queen of Scots, replace her. Questions of succession remained unanswered, for Elizabeth showed no sign of marriage or children. But for the moment, hope outweighed fear. The young queen, who had once been dismissed as illegitimate, who had walked the Tower in dread, now strode through Westminster with authority. She was shaping not only her own fate, but the destiny of her kingdom. In her coronation, in her settlement of religion, and in her refusal to marry, she had already shown that she was not a pawn to be played by others. She was a ruler in her own right. The girl who had been born to disappointment had grown into a woman who commanded the loyalty of her people. The early challenges of her reign revealed her gifts for caution, for image, and for survival. Qualities forged in the shadows of her youth, but now carried into the light of power. England watched her closely, but Elizabeth was ready. She had learned long ago that the crown was a perilous gift, and she wore it with both caution and pride. The Virgin Queen was ascending, and the story of her reign was only just beginning. Elizabeth's reign moved into its second decade with the glow of promise, yet beneath the surface danger gathered. She had held the crown with grace and care, balancing religion with moderation, ruling with the guidance of trusted advisors, and building an image of herself as both untouchable and beloved. But England was not at peace. The question of faith still burned, and across Europe Catholic monarchs looked upon Elizabeth with suspicion and scorn. At home too she faced whispers, plots, and the shadow of a cousin who would never cease to haunt her, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had returned to Scotland in 1561 after the death of her French husband. She was young, beautiful, and Catholic, and to many she represented a rival vision of monarchy, one that could undo all Elizabeth had built. Though Elizabeth hesitated to meet her face to face, the connection between them was inescapable. Mary was seen by Catholic powers as the rightful Queen of England, since they viewed Elizabeth's birth as illegitimate. To Elizabeth, Mary was both family and threat, a woman she could neither trust nor fully destroy, not yet. Their relationship would become one of the defining struggles of Elizabeth's reign, a battle of patience and intrigue rather than open war, and it would test every skill Elizabeth had learned in her years of survival. Even before Mary's presence became the great challenge, Elizabeth faced unrest within her own realm. The settlement of religion she had crafted was fragile. While many accepted it for the sake of peace, zealots on both sides were unsatisfied. Protestants wanted greater reform, Catholics wished for restoration. In 1569 discontent boiled over in the north, where powerful Catholic nobles rose in rebellion. The northern earls, loyal to Rome and hope for placing Mary in Elizabeth's stead, gathered supporters and raised banners. They sought to march south, to free Mary, who was now a prisoner in England after fleeing her own country, and to restore Catholic worship. Elizabeth's response was firm and swift. Her forces suppressed the rebellion, and those captured were punished with brutal severity. Hundreds were executed, their bodies displayed as a warning. Elizabeth was not by nature cruel, yet she understood that mercy at such a moment would invite further defiance. She ruled with caution, but when challenged she showed steel. The rebellion made clear that Mary's presence on English soil was a constant danger, a beacon for those who dreamed of Elizabeth's fall. Still, Elizabeth resisted calls to end Mary's life. She knew too well the weight of spilling royal blood, and she feared the reaction it might stir abroad. Abroad, the pressure on Elizabeth grew sharper. The Pope excommunicated her in 1570, declaring her a heretic and releasing her subjects from loyalty to her. This papal bull was more than words, it was a weapon. It gave license to plotters who might raise a dagger against her, and it encouraged Catholic monarchs to see her as an enemy of the true faith. From this moment Elizabeth's life was in constant peril. Assassination attempts were whispered, conspiracies were uncovered, and spies became an essential shield around her. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, built a web of informants across Europe, intercepting letters, infiltrating cells, and exposing traitors. Elizabeth's reign became one of watchfulness, not only in the palace, but in every corner of her kingdom. At court, too, the question of marriage continued to circle her. Years had passed, and still she remained unmarried. Some urged her to take a husband for the sake of succession and stability. Foreign princes still sought her hand, and rumours of her closeness to Robert Dudley continued to stir unease. Yet Elizabeth resisted. Each year she remained single, her resolve seemed firmer, and the image of the Virgin Queen grew stronger. She turned what might have been seen as weakness into strength, portraying herself as wedded to her realm, untouched by the divisions that plagued others. For those who plotted, this made her both mysterious and untouchable. For her people, it allowed them to imagine her as something more than mortal, a figure above the struggles of ordinary women. But enemies did not rest. In the 1570s and 1580s, plots multiplied. One of the most famous was the Ridolfi plot, in which a Florentine banker, Catholic nobles, and even support from Spain sought to replace Elizabeth with Mary. The scheme was uncovered, and the Duke of Norfolk, once a powerful noble, was executed. Later came the Throckmorton plot, involving foreign intervention and plans to murder Elizabeth, again in favour of Mary. Each time Walsingham's spies broke the network, yet each time Elizabeth was reminded of her peril. She lived not only as queen, but as a target. Mary's role in these plots grew clearer. Though a prisoner, she continued to communicate with allies, smuggling letters and seeking support from abroad. Elizabeth was reluctant to strike at her, torn between her sense of justice, her fear of setting a precedent by killing an anointed queen, and her recognition of the danger Mary posed. Her counsellors pressed her to act, warning that Mary was the heart of every scheme. Elizabeth hesitated, as she so often did, weighing the risks with care. The tension between Elizabeth's caution and her counsellors' urgency reached a breaking point with the Babington plot of 1586. This conspiracy planned not only to murder Elizabeth, but to place Mary directly on the throne with the aid of Spanish troops. Walsingham's agents intercepted the letters, and this time Mary's guilt was undeniable. She had approved the plan in her own hand. Elizabeth now faced the hardest choice of her reign. To spare Mary was to invite further attempts on her life. To execute her was to shed the blood of a queen and risk outrage from Catholic Europe. For weeks Elizabeth delayed, signing the death warrant, then hesitating to send it. At last, in February 1587, the deed was done. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, her head struck from her body in a solemn and dramatic scene. The moment was both a release and a burden. Elizabeth claimed sorrow, even anger, at the manner in which the execution was carried out, yet she must have known it was unavoidable. Mary's death removed the most dangerous rival, but it also turned her into a martyr in the eyes of many Catholics. Spain, already hostile, now had fresh cause for war. The years that followed saw Elizabeth's enemies gather abroad. Philip of Spain, once her suitor, now her greatest foe, prepared his vast armada to strike at England. The execution of Mary was one spark, but the deeper cause was the clash of faith and power between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. Elizabeth's support for Dutch rebels against Spanish rule, and the raids of English privateers on Spanish treasure ships added to the fury. By 1588 the storm was ready to break. Yet even before the Armada sailed, Elizabeth's reign had already been marked by constant threats, both within and without. At home rebellion had been crushed, conspiracies had been foiled, and rivals had been watched and removed. Abroad alliances had shifted, plots had been hatched in shadow, and the Queen herself had lived under constant risk of the assassin's hand. Through it all, Elizabeth endured with the same qualities that had marked her since childhood: patience, caution, and an unshakable belief in her own destiny. Her ability to survive was not chance. It was the result of her sharp mind, her instinct for reading people, her mastery of silence, and her gift for turning necessity into image. She was the Virgin Queen, untouchable, watching from her throne as enemies struck and fell. Yet behind that image lay a woman who knew the taste of fear, who understood how close death always hovered. It was that knowledge that made her strong, for she never forgot the lessons of her youth in the Tower, when her life had hung by a thread. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth's reign was moving into a new stage. The execution of Mary had changed everything, removing one threat, but unleashing another. The realm braced for war, and Elizabeth prepared to stand before her people not only as queen, but as a leader in battle. The years of plots and conspiracies, of whispers and daggers in the dark, had forged her into a figure of endurance. Now she would face the greatest challenge yet, a clash not of hidden letters and secret meetings, but of ships, cannon, and the fate of her kingdom. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 removed Elizabeth's greatest rival within her own kingdom, yet it also unleashed the wrath of Spain. Philip II, king of the most powerful empire in the world, was already enraged by English support for rebels in the Netherlands and by the plundering of Spanish treasure fleets by English seafarers. Now, with Mary's blood on Elizabeth's hands, he was given both a cause and a rallying cry. He declared it his holy mission to invade England, to overthrow the heretic queen, and to restore Catholic faith to her throne. Thus was born the Spanish Armada, a fleet so vast that it was said the very seas would tremble at its sight. For Elizabeth the threat was unlike any she had faced before. Plots and rebellions had been shadows, daggers in the dark, but this was to be war, an open clash between kingdoms. Spain was richer, larger, and possessed armies and fleets that dwarfed those of England. The Armada was planned as an unstoppable force. More than 100 ships carrying thousands of men, sailing to join with Spanish forces in the Netherlands before landing on English soil. If successful, it would end Elizabeth's reign, and likely her life, within months. England prepared as best it could. The navy was smaller than Spain's, but more agile, with lighter ships and experienced captains. Among them were men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, who had cut their teeth on raids across the Atlantic and who knew the sea as second nature. They urged tactics of speed and harassment, rather than the heavy boarding favoured by Spain. Elizabeth listened to their advice, but also understood that the strength of the nation lay not only in ships but in spirit. She knew she must inspire her people, that they must see her not as a distant ruler, but as one of them, standing firm against the storm. In the summer of 1588, the Armada sailed from Spain. Its crescent formation stretched across the Channel like a moving fortress. At first the English shadowed it, darting in to fire, then retreating, chipping away but avoiding direct collision. Drake captured supplies, disrupted formations, and forced the Spaniards into constant manoeuvres. Yet the Armada pressed on, determined to meet the Duke of Parma's forces in the Netherlands and prepare the invasion. The decisive moment came off Calais, when the English launched fireships into the anchored Spanish fleet. Panic spread as the great hulks drifted into their midst, and the Armada scattered in disorder. The English seized the chance, pressing hard at gravlines, their lighter ships darting around the larger galleons, firing with deadly accuracy. The battle raged for hours, and though the Spanish ships were strong, they could not reform their line. Wind and tide turned against them, and at last they were forced to retreat into the North Sea. The Armada's retreat was as disastrous as the battle itself. Chased northwards, battered by storms around Scotland and Ireland, many ships were wrecked upon the rocks. Of the vast fleet that had sailed, barely half returned to Spain, broken and defeated. The dream of conquest was shattered, and Elizabeth's reign had survived its greatest threat. The victory was not simply military, it was spiritual and symbolic. Against all odds, England had stood firm against the might of Spain, and Elizabeth became the living embodiment of that triumph. Her words to the troops at Tilbury became legend. Dressed in armour, she declared that though she was but a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Whether spoken exactly as remembered or polished by time, the speech captured the spirit of her rule. She had placed herself among her people, sharing their danger, and in doing so had bound them to her with unshakable loyalty. The Armada transformed Elizabeth's image into that of Gloriana, the warrior queen chosen by God to defend her realm. Artists painted her triumphant, standing upon maps of Europe, the defeated Armada burning behind her. Poets sang her praises, comparing her to goddesses and heroines of old. She herself embraced the role, cultivating the sense that she was more than mortal, that she was the very spirit of England made flesh. It was a carefully shaped image, but it rested upon truth, for she had faced the storm and emerged unbroken. Yet victory did not mean safety. Spain remained a powerful enemy, and though no second Armada ever matched the scale of the first, attempts at invasion continued. The war dragged on, draining resources and testing patience. But the moment of 1588 had given Elizabeth and her people something greater than security. It had given them confidence, a belief that England could stand against the greatest powers of Europe, that it had a destiny upon the seas. That spirit would outlast Elizabeth herself, carrying the nation into a new age of exploration and ambition. The triumph also deepened her bond with her subjects. Elizabeth had always been skilled at presenting herself as accessible, showing her face on royal progresses, listening to the cries of the crowd, and speaking with warmth. After the Armada, this bond was stronger than ever. She was not only their queen, but their protector, the woman who had stood with them in their hour of danger. The image of Gloriana was not distant or cold, but radiant, a figure of majesty who still belonged to her people. At court, the glow of victory encouraged culture and pageantry. Writers such as Edmund Spenser and later William Shakespeare flourished under her reign, weaving her triumphs into the fabric of their works. Music, theatre, and poetry all celebrated her, and her presence infused them with grandeur. Elizabeth encouraged this, knowing that art could shape memory as much as war. She became the muse of an age, her face a name tied to a golden vision of England. Yet she remained cautious. Beneath the splendour, Elizabeth never forgot that her throne had been threatened and could be again. She continued to rely on her council, on Cecil and Walsingham, on Dudley and others to guard against plots. She managed her image with the same care as before, refusing portraits that showed her age, insisting on symbols of strength and youth. She balanced factions at court, never giving too much power to any one noble, never allowing herself to be cornered. She was triumphant, but she remained the same woman who had once walked the halls of the Tower, wary of every shadow. The Armada also sharpened the legend of her virginity. By refusing marriage, she had left herself unclaimed by any foreign power, free to embody the realm itself. After 1588, that choice seemed providential, as though by not binding herself to Spain, France, or any prince, she had preserved England's independence. Her virginity became not only personal but political, a sign of her purity and dedication. She was no longer merely Elizabeth, she was the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, whose body was England and whose soul was its strength. Still, her refusal to marry and produce an heir left uncertainty. Parliament pressed her, councillors urged her, yet she remained firm. She teased with hints, entertained offers, then let them fade. In truth, she knew that marriage would divide, not unite. To choose a Protestant prince would anger Catholics. To choose a Catholic would provoke Protestants. To choose an Englishman would stir jealousy and rivalry. Better to remain unwed, untouchable, and to let her people imagine her as theirs alone. The years after the Armada saw England expand its reach. Privateers and explorers sailed further, bringing tales of new lands and riches. The seeds of empire were sown, though often more by daring individuals than by crown policy. Elizabeth encouraged them cautiously, granting charters, offering approval, but always careful not to overextend. She celebrated their discoveries as signs of national glory, weaving them into the legend of her reign. Yet even as her fame grew, challenges remained. The war with Spain dragged on, draining the treasury, and the failure of some expeditions dimmed the glow of triumph. Rebellions in Ireland consumed men and money, testing her patience and her strength. The court too grew restless, with younger nobles seeking favour and power. But none of this could undo the memory of 1588, when the Armada had been scattered, and Elizabeth had stood as the heart of her nation. The Armada became the defining moment of her reign, the moment when all the qualities she had forged in youth came together: caution, patience, resolve, and the power of image. She had turned survival into triumph, fear into strength, and threat into glory. She had shown herself not as a pawn of fate, but as its master. For her people, the victory was proof that she was chosen by God, a queen unlike any before. For her enemies, it was a warning that she was not to be underestimated. For herself, it was a confirmation that all the years of restraint and silence had been worth it. She had endured, she had waited, and when the greatest challenge came, she had risen to meet it. Elizabeth would rule for many more years, facing fresh dangers and personal trials, but the image forged in those days of 1588 would never fade. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who had stood against the might of Spain and prevailed. In that image lay the essence of her reign, a blend of majesty and humanity, of caution and splendour, of vulnerability and strength. The Armada had come to destroy her, but instead it had made her immortal. The glow of the Armada still lit Elizabeth's court in the years that followed, yet time, which no victory could defeat, began to weigh upon her. By the 1590s she had ruled for more than 3 decades, longer than most of her subjects could remember. She was a figure of near myth, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the heart of England. Yet behind the splendour of portraits and pageants, age was creeping into her body, and shadows of doubt and strain were falling upon her reign. Her most trusted advisers were growing old or leaving her. William Cecil, who had guided her from the first days of her rule, was nearing the end of his long service. Francis Walsingham, her spymaster who had kept her alive against countless plots, died in 1590. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, her childhood friend and perhaps the only man she had truly loved, had died 2 years earlier. Each loss hollowed her court, leaving her surrounded by younger men whose loyalty was uncertain and whose ambitions often clashed. The most striking of these was Robert de Vaux, the Earl of Essex. Dashing, ambitious, and headstrong, Essex captured the Queen's favour in her later years. He was more than 30 years her junior, yet he played the role of gallant courtier with skill, showering her with charm and bold words. Elizabeth, lonely and weary, delighted in his company, though he often tested her patience with his arrogance. He sought to be not only her favourite but her master, pushing for military commands and political influence. Unlike Cecil or Dudley, Essex lacked restraint. He believed he could bend the Queen to his will, but in doing so he underestimated her resolve. The war with Spain still dragged on through the 1590s, though the great drama of the Armada had passed. England sent expeditions to the continent and to Ireland, often at Essex's urging, but many ended in failure or disappointment. Essex himself led a campaign in Ireland in 1599, charged with putting down rebellion, yet he achieved little and returned home without permission. Bursting into the Queen's chamber unannounced, he saw her without her wigs or makeup, revealing the frailty of age she worked so hard to hide. That moment marked a turning point. Elizabeth never forgave the insult, and their relationship began to unravel. Essex's pride would not allow him to fade quietly. In 1601 he launched a reckless rebellion in London, hoping to rally support and seize control of the court. Few joined him, and the rising collapsed within hours. He was arrested, tried for treason, and condemned. Elizabeth hesitated, as she always did when faced with the shedding of noble blood, but at last she signed the warrant. Essex was executed. His head struck off upon the block, and the Queen was left to mourn another loss, not only of a man she had once favoured, but of the illusion that youth and gallantry could shield her from the harshness of time. As her court shifted, so too did her image. The portraits that once showed her as radiant and youthful became increasingly elaborate, designed to mask the truth. Symbols of strength and eternity filled the canvases. Globes beneath her hand, suns shining behind her, roses and pearls adorning her dress. Yet those who saw her in person could not mistake the change. She was in her 60s, her teeth blackened, her hair thin, her body weakened by years of strain. She clung to the splendour of her image with determination, refusing to allow painters to show her as she truly was. The cult of Gloriana endured, but it became ever more a mask. Loneliness pressed heavily upon her. She had never married, never borne children, and though she claimed her people as her family, she could not escape the quiet emptiness of her private life. Courtiers wrote of her long evenings, pacing in silence, lost in thought. She relied upon her ladies for company, but many of those she had known since youth were gone. Even her small circle of pets, dogs and parrots she cherished, became sources of comfort in a court that often seemed filled with ambition rather than affection. The burden of succession grew heavier as the years passed. Without a child of her own, the question of who would follow her haunted every corner of her reign. To name an heir was to invite plots, for rivals might rally around them while she still lived. To leave it unspoken risked chaos when she died. She managed the dilemma with the same caution she had shown in all things, refusing to commit while hinting at possibilities. By the late 1590s, James of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the most likely candidate, a Protestant with a strong claim. Elizabeth never declared him outright, but she allowed enough signals that when her final hour came, the transition could be managed without bloodshed. Religion, too, remained a constant weight. Though her settlement had brought peace, tensions never fully disappeared. Puritans pressed for greater reform, Catholics still conspired in secret, and the war with Spain fed fears of invasion. Yet Elizabeth's skill in balancing extremes held firm. She tolerated private faith so long as outward obedience was given. She punished harshly when her authority was threatened, but she never descended into the bloody zeal of her sister's reign. Even in her later years, weary though she was, she kept her course steady. Despite the hardships, the cultural bloom of her reign continued. The theatres of London rang with the words of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and their peers. Music and poetry flourished, often reflecting upon the Queen herself. She remained the muse of her age, her image woven into allegory and song. Though time weakened her body, the legend of Elizabeth as Gloriana endured, more powerful than truth, sustained by the art and pageantry she had cultivated. Her final years were marked by a kind of melancholy dignity. She withdrew more often from the public eye, yet when she appeared she still commanded devotion. Crowds still cheered her, nobles still bowed, and ambassadors still marvelled at her authority. She had become something larger than herself, a symbol of endurance, of stability, of England itself. Yet in her private chambers the Queen, who had once sparkled with wit and energy, now sat in silence, weighed down by the deaths of her closest companions, by the loneliness of her chosen path, and by the slow decline of age. Those around her noticed her sadness, describing her as restless, unable to sleep, unwilling to eat. She resisted the approach of death with the same stubborn will she had shown all her life, but she could not deny its shadow. The Essex rebellion had cut her deeply, and though she had ordered his death, she carried guilt for it. She spoke of him often, at times with anger, at times with sorrow, as though unable to free herself from the memory. She brooded on the past, on choices made and paths not taken. Perhaps she wondered what her life might have been had she married, had she borne children, had she not been shaped by danger and caution. Yet whatever her private doubts, she never allowed them to undo the strength of her public role. By 1603 Elizabeth was 70, a remarkable age for the time, and her health was failing. She withdrew to Richmond Palace, refusing her bed, preferring to rest upon cushions upon the floor. She spoke little, yet her presence still carried weight. Courtiers watched anxiously, knowing that the end of her reign would mark the end of an era. She gestured at last towards James of Scotland as her successor, ensuring a smooth path for him to the throne. On the 24th of March she died, quietly, after more than 44 years upon the throne. The woman who had been born to disappointment, who had survived the fall of her mother, the suspicion of her sister, the threat of plots and invasions, was gone. England mourned her not only as a queen, but as the embodiment of an age. Her death closed the Tudor line, yet her legacy was so deeply woven into the soul of the realm that it did not fade. In her later years Elizabeth had been lonely, worried by loss, and haunted by the shadows of time. Yet she remained the figure she had always been, cautious, strong, and unyielding. She had refused to marry, refused to share her throne, and refused to let her image weaken. She had carried herself as more than mortal, as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the heart of her nation. Even as age bent her body, her spirit remained unbroken. The later years of her reign may not have been marked by the triumphs of youth, but they revealed the depth of her endurance. She had outlived her enemies, outlasted her rivals, and kept her crown for nearly half a century. She had given England stability after chaos, identity after doubt, and pride after fear. The melancholy of her old age was the price of the choices she had made, yet it did not undo the greatness of her reign. Elizabeth's story was one of survival, of transformation, of a woman who turned weakness into strength and caution into power. In her final years she was no longer the radiant figure of Tilbury or the dazzling muse of poets, but she remained a queen whose authority was unquestioned, whose presence was revered, and whose legend would outlive her. She had begun life unwanted, born to a mother who was executed, declared illegitimate, imprisoned by her sister, threatened by assassins, and menaced by foreign powers. Yet she had endured, she had reigned, and she had shaped the destiny of a nation. Her later years were a mirror of her life as a whole, marked by loss, by loneliness, but also by the unshakable strength of a woman who refused to be broken. Elizabeth was gone, but Gloriana would never die. Elizabeth's last days were marked by silence and stillness, as though the weight of nearly half a century on the throne had finally pressed her into the shadows. She retreated to Richmond Palace in early 1603, away from the noise of London, carrying with her the weariness of age and the burden of memory. She refused her bed, instead resting upon cushions upon the floor, her thin body propped, as if even then she was unwilling to surrender to weakness. Courtiers came and went in hushed tones, fearful of disturbing her, and yet eager to know whether she would name her successor. England held its breath, for the question of what would follow her death had haunted the realm for decades. Those closest to her described her as restless and withdrawn. She spoke little, at times staring into the distance, as though seeing not the present, but the long path of her life. She had outlived her friends, her suitors, her advisors, even her rivals. She had survived conspiracies, wars, and betrayals, but she could not defeat time. The woman who had once danced and laughed, who had spoken with wit and fire, was now quiet, wrapped in her thoughts. Perhaps she was reflecting upon her mother, whose shadow had never left her. Perhaps she remembered the Tower, where she had waited to die, or Tilbury, where she had declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. Perhaps she thought of Robert Dudley, or of Robert de Villeux, the Earl of Essex, whose death she had ordered with sorrow. Whatever passed through her mind, it remained locked within her, for she gave few words to those around her. When pressed about the succession, she raised her hand towards the name most had already guessed, James of Scotland. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the cousin Elizabeth had executed. Yet he was Protestant. He was strong enough to claim the crown, and he offered the hope of peace after years of uncertainty. By pointing to James, she ensured that the kingdom would not collapse into chaos when she passed. It was the last act of a lifetime of caution, leaving no clear declaration but enough for her counsellors to act. On the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth died. She was 70 years old, a remarkable span for her time, and she had ruled for 44 of those years. The news spread with shock, for though her decline had been visible, many had come to believe she was almost eternal. She had been queen for as long as most could remember, and her image had grown into something larger than life. Now she was gone, and the Tudor dynasty ended with her. Her death brought mourning across the realm. Bells tolled in churches, crowds gathered in silence, and people wept in the streets. They grieved not only the loss of a monarch, but of a figure who had become the very symbol of their age. Elizabeth had been more than queen, she had been England itself, and her passing felt like the closing of a chapter in history. Her funeral was a grand affair, befitting the scale of her reign. The coffin was draped in velvet, a wax effigy of the Queen, in full regalia placed upon it. Crowds lined the streets of London as the procession passed, nobles, soldiers, and common folk alike following in solemn respect. Many remarked upon the silence that hung over the city, broken only by the slow toll of bells and the tread of feet. To see her carried to her grave was to see the end of an age. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in a tomb later shared with her sister Mary. The irony of their rest together was striking. Two women whose lives had been bound by rivalry and suspicion, now lying side by side. Upon their tomb is carved an inscription that honours Elizabeth as the most glorious and powerful queen, whose reign brought peace and stability to England. The words, like the legend, sought to capture what she had meant to her people. With her death, the crown passed smoothly to James of Scotland, beginning the Stuart line. That the transfer occurred without bloodshed was itself part of Elizabeth's legacy, a testament to her careful management of succession. England entered a new age, but the shadow of Elizabeth stretched long. Her reign had shaped the nation's identity, and her memory became the standard against which later rulers would be measured. The legacy she left was vast. Politically, she had given England stability. After the turmoil of her father and siblings, she had steered a middle course in religion, creating a settlement that, though contested, endured. She had faced down rebellion and invasion, most famously the Armada, and in doing so had given her people confidence in their strength. She had turned England from a vulnerable kingdom into a nation that believed it could stand against the might of Europe. Culturally, her reign had been a golden age. Writers such as Shakespeare, Spencer, and Marlowe had flourished, producing works that defined not only their era, but the centuries that followed. Music, theatre, and art had been enriched under her patronage. The image of Elizabeth herself had become central to this culture, painted and sung as a goddess, a muse, a warrior, and a virgin. The very idea of Gloriana was as much a cultural creation as a political one, and it endured long after her death. Her foreign policy too left a mark. Though cautious in direct war, she had encouraged voyages that expanded England's horizons. The seeds of empire were sown in her time, as explorers reached the Americas and the edges of the world. Though not all ventures succeeded, the spirit of adventure they fostered carried forward, shaping the destiny of the nation in the centuries to come. Yet her legacy was not without shadow. Ireland remained scarred by rebellion and repression during her reign, and the war drained lives and treasure. The refusal to settle the succession more clearly left uncertainty until the final days. Her reliance on image sometimes veiled the harsher truths of age and weakness. For all her triumphs, she ended her days lonely, her court filled with younger men who could not replace the companions she had lost. Still, the greatness of her reign lay in what she overcame. Born unwanted, the daughter of a queen executed, declared illegitimate, imprisoned by her sister, threatened by enemies abroad and at home, she endured. She survived when survival seemed impossible, and she turned endurance into majesty. Her life was not one of ease, but of constant peril, and it was that very struggle that shaped her into the monarch she became. Elizabeth's legacy also lived in memory in the way people spoke of her after her death. For her subjects, she became the golden queen of their youth, the ruler who had brought them pride and safety. For historians, she became a figure of endless debate, praised for her wisdom, criticized for her caution, admired for her charisma, questioned for her choices. For artists and writers, she remained an icon, a figure whose image could be reshaped endlessly, half woman, half myth. In the centuries that followed, her legend only grew. The Elizabethan age became a term of glory, linked with triumph on sea, brilliance in theatre, and confidence in nationhood. She was remembered as the queen who defied Spain, who gave her people a voice, who ruled with intelligence and grace. Even her virginity became part of her myth, a symbol of purity and dedication, though in truth it was a political choice as much as a personal one. The tomb at Westminster may hold her bones, but the spirit of Elizabeth lives wherever England remembers its past. In the speech at Tilbury, in the portraits where her face glows eternal, in the plays and poems that echoed her name, in the memory of the Armada's defeat, she remains. She is not only a figure of history, but a symbol of resilience, of what it means to face danger with courage, and to turn survival into glory. Her reign ended, but her story did not. For as long as England has looked back upon its history, Elizabeth has stood at its centre, not simply as a queen, but as a legend. She is Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, the woman who turned frailty into power, and who shaped the destiny of a nation.